Good evening, everybody. We're pleased to have you joining us tonight for a Chicago Living Corridors program on landscaping for birds. My name is Peggy Simonson, and I just want to give you a little introduction before we get right into the program. If you're having issues on your in being connected, make sure you have your computer audio on. There's a little bar up on the far right at the top button that says computer audio. If you're hearing me, you won't be able to talk now because you're muted, but if you have any questions, if you can hear me and have issues, you can either click the little raise your hand button, or you can write something in the chat box, just right below that, and express that there's a problem of any kind. We've not had too many. We go pretty smoothly with these, but if there's any issues, we want you to be able to solve them before we move forward. I'd like to give you a little background on Chicago Living Corridors, the organization, before we get into the program. CLC is the organization that's sponsoring these webinars. We've been doing one a month, and we have some scheduled for November and December. We'll tell you about at the end of the program. Our mission is to focus on property and private ownership, which in Illinois is 90 to 95%. Our work, though, is in the Chicago area, and one of our goals is to map private property that's become quality habitat. And we do that by putting dots on a map, which I'll show you in a minute. Another purpose is to inspire and inform residents to plant native plants. For a lot of reasons, one of which is to support the birds that you're going to hear about tonight. And we also really want to encourage individuals to join local conservation organizations. CLC is an umbrella group, and in that capacity, we are made up of other organizations in the Chicago area that help residents improve habitat on their property. I'm connected with Citizens for Conservation. We have a program called Habitat Corridors. Another founding organization is the Wildflower Preservation and Propagation Committee's mentoring program called A Natural Garden in Your Yard. And the Conservation Foundation has the Conservation at Home program with a number of organizations in the Chicago area. And there's also the Northern Kane and West Cook Wild Ones chapters that have programs to help encourage native plants in individuals in homeowners' yards, property yards. In addition to the founding organizations, these are the other organizations that have been participating. You can see the list of them here. So to a large extent, we cover pretty much of the whole Chicago area. And so one of the issues for if you're an individual that has already improved the habitat on your yard and would like to become connected, you should connect through one of these organizations or one of these founding organizations. And let me show you the map. This is a little bit hard to tell about right now, but this map is on the ChicagoLivingCorridors.org website, and the different it's interactive on the website. Excuse me, and the different colored maps, excuse me, the different colored dots tell which organizations are working in that area. I do not have COVID. Sorry, got in my throat. So I encourage you to go to the Chicago Living Corridors website and play with the map and see which organizations are where. So that's the background on CLC. I'd like now to introduce our speaker for tonight, Lisa Maier. She started birding around 10 years ago, and it's since become a full-blown obsession. While watching birds, she became interested in the interconnections between birds, the insects that they eat, and the plants that support them. She leads bird walks and trips to share her enthusiasm with others. As Vice President of McHenry County Audubon, Lisa conducts surveys for McHenry County Conservation District and the Bird Conservation Network, and participates in other citizen science activities such as Hawkwatch, spring and Christmas bird counts, and Feederwatch. Lisa is currently a mentor for the Wildflower Preservation and Propagation Committee's Natural Garden in Your Yard program that we were just talking about. And she has spent the last several years turning her own property into a birding hotspot. She has documented over 130 bird species, as well as a menagerie of insects and other wildlife in her own yard in McHenry County. I'm pleased now to introduce Lisa Maier and her program, Landscaping for Birds. Lisa.
Thank you, Peggy. And thank you, everybody, for joining tonight. It's so great to see the growing interest in native plants and gardening specifically for wildlife. So great to see everybody here. I should mention that all the photos you're about to see are either mine or members of McHenry County Audubon, the WPPC, as well as a few people from the Illinois Audubon Bird and Butterfly Sanctuary program that was on the previous slide. So, make sure I have. Oh, there we go. All right. So, why are we talking about this? Why plant for birds? Why landscape our yard for birds? This picture here is a rose-breasted grosbeak, a really handsome male, and this was taken on May 10th. And as you may be able to see, there are snowflakes in the air. It was this year, if you recall, if you live in northern Illinois, it was a very bizarre spring. It was very cold up until May, and for a lot of birds, that causes a lot of issues. This bird here, the rose-breasted grosbeak, spends nearly half its life in the tropics, so it doesn't like cold. So this poor guy is just sitting here trying to keep warm. And the point is that birds face a lot of issues. They face a lot of hardships, and especially migratory birds like this one, there's a lot of obstacles and to face, like climate change, like insect collapse, habitat loss. And if you've heard of the recent reports that we've lost millions, billions of birds in the last several years, the declines are unreal. So a lot of that can make us feel overwhelmed. And there's a lot we can do as homeowners. And even if you're not a homeowner, if you just live in an apartment or a condo and don't have a lot of land, but maybe have a balcony space or something, there's things you can do that make a huge difference to wildlife. So this is a typical suburban yard, right? There's a large expanse of lawn. There's non-native shrubs. There's some honeysuckle, mulberry, Chinese crabapple, typical things. There's a burning bush in the corner. So typical suburban yard, right? Unfortunately, this type of yard is not biologically, ecologically alive. It doesn't support a lot of life. It's kind of a dead zone. And unfortunately, a lot of yards look like this. Most yards look like this. And if we just think about our little space and expand it out to our whole neighborhood and our whole region, and think about if we change the way we manage our yards to look a little bit more like this, to something that's more ecologically alive, that supports wildlife, that supports birds, that supports insects and amphibians and all types of things, then imagine if every yard looked like this, and every yard in the neighborhood, at least, you don't have to go extreme, but at least partially converted their yard to a more natural state. It would provide such support for wildlife. And I think that's one of the goals of Chicago Living Corridors, is that idea of creating these spaces for birds and other wildlife, because birds and other wildlife aren't just reserved to our forest preserves and our conservation districts and our parks. They live among us. They live everywhere. And especially birds that have to travel sometimes across countries. They, you know, if we can give them a safe space to land, that's great. And we have control over this space. So the decisions we make in our yard are super important for wildlife. So why native plants? Why do birds need native plants? One of the most obvious ones, food. And food comes in all types of forms from native plants, whether it's berries, whether it's seeds, nuts, or the insects that native plants support. And we'll get into that quite a bit. Shelter is the other big one, and that's where structural diversity in the yard becomes very important, because birds can be way up high in the tree or they can be down on the ground, depending on the species of bird. And birds need shelter all year round throughout the year. And then finally, nesting habitat and nesting the materials. And birds, again, all different types of nest, all different types of material. And if we manage our yards, we can provide these things that birds need throughout the year, just by doing a few simple things, really. So just the way we're going to kind of go through this is the way our yards work. In Northern Illinois, we certainly have seasons and very dramatic changes in seasons, and definitely birds have very different seasons. They're very in tune with the seasons. And if you watch them enough, you know what birds come in spring, when they leave and all that. So in spring, migration is the big event for birds. A lot of them are moving through the area, and they need fuel, especially to fuel food to fuel them on their journey. Spring is also when local and early nesters start, and that's your local birds, the birds you see all year round. They start to nest early because they're already where they need to be. So insects, we're going to start with food. Insects are really the big one for birds. Really nothing, most birds in North America eat insects. Even birds we don't think of that normally eat insects, like this hummingbird here, they also eat insects. Only a very small percentage of birds don't eat insects, and that's just mainly finches and mourning doves. So this spring, I noticed that on Facebook and on other sites and other things, a lot of people reporting birds eating dandelion seeds, like this goldfinches. Now, goldfinches are kind of an exception to the rule because they are mainly herbivores. They mainly eat seeds. They rarely eat insects. They're kind of an exception. But a lot of other birds were eating dandelion seeds, because dandelions turn to seed very, very quickly and early in the year before a lot of other stuff does. I had also a lot of birds were reported at suet feeders, at oriole feeders, and other feeders. And I think part of that is because we had a strange spring where it was so cold in the beginning that the timing that birds do to migrate, they're trying to time with the emergence of budworms, which are caterpillars of moths mainly, that emerge when the buds of trees open up the leaves. So that timing, I think, was off, and these birds were desperate for food. So they were going to whatever resource they could find. And unfortunately, with the insect collapses that we've seen in recent years, especially the last 20 years mainly, we've seen a lot of our, especially our large insect-eating birds, start to decline heavily. And that has to do with the fact that they are just not getting enough food. A lot of the big flying insects like moths, like butterflies, like some of the bigger flies, they have been declining. And if you think of the energy it takes to get a moth, a big fat juicy moth, versus a bunch of tiny mosquitoes, it takes a lot more energy to get all those mosquitoes than to get a few moths. So these birds are spending a lot more energy to try to get this food because there's a lack of it. And unfortunately, that's bad enough for migrants. But when you get into breeding season, a lack of food is even more detrimental to successful breeding. So going away from insects for a moment, another important thing about providing natives is, and we'll get more into insects later as well, is blooming. It's important to pollinators as well to have a succession of blooms. It's very important to one bird in particular, and that's the hummingbird. Everybody loves hummingbirds. They're a very unique bird. So just like you would provide a succession of blooms for bumblebees or other pollinators, you want to provide early spring blooms for hummingbirds when they're first coming through a migration. And sometimes that's really early in April, but usually more towards May. So you want things that bloom around that time. These are a couple early nesters. Owls definitely nest extremely early, sometimes as early as even late December, January. I think more towards February in our area. But it's important to provide that habitat for them. And again, bigger birds need bigger trees usually. Smaller birds like smaller structures, but that's where that habitat structure comes into play. And here you could see a red-tailed hawk being chased by a crow. Again, both local birds that will start nesting pretty early. Chickadees, nuthatches, I've seen them starting to nest as early as late March. So breeding season we kind of think of as June, July, and it definitely starts way earlier than that. I gave it away because I hit the button too quickly. But anyway, so this bird here is obviously very well camouflaged. This is another super early nester. This is an American woodcock. And as you can see, this is a ground nester. So like the owl and the hawk and even the crow, they all nest pretty high up in big trees. But here's a bird that nests on the ground. So, and again, a very early spring. So you can see it's still very dead looking, a lot of litter on the ground. So again, just providing a mix of habitats, a mix of space, which we'll get into more for birds when they're starting to nest as well as on their journey. So I'll touch on a couple trees and specific shrubs especially that I think are really phenomenal in terms of providing for birds. So oaks are probably the king of trees. They not only provide, you know, shelter, nesting habitat, food in the form of acorns, but they are also, they host more species of moth and butterfly caterpillars than almost any other tree. And what does a host plant mean? A host plant just means that the insects evolved to, our local insects evolved to eat the leaves, which contain chemicals in them that typically repel a lot of other insects. So some insects are very specific in the type of plant they eat. Some are more general and they can eat a lot of things. But like a monarch butterfly only eats milkweed, the caterpillar. So milkweed's super important for monarchs. Without the milkweed, there'd be no monarch butterfly. So that's what I'm referring to when I say host. That means that that insect or those number of insects can use that tree, shrub, for grass, whatever it is, as a host plant for their larvae. So hickory is another great tree, especially in spring. Beautiful one too, when it starts to, the leaves start to come out. It almost looks like a flower blooming. Big trees are really the important one in spring because they do bud out typically before most other things. Maple's another good one. I see a lot of warblers and stuff in maples, oaks especially. Maples I know are a little weedy too. Not a lot of people like silver maples. They get everywhere. They start growing up everywhere. But if you think of the habitat you're in, especially like a floodplain habitat, silver maples are one of the staple trees. So they're very happy in that habitat and they just kind of take over. But they're a super important tree. Again, 250 plus host species for caterpillars. And then they do hollow out, and that provides a lot of good nesting and roosting areas for like this eastern screech owl here and a northern flicker nesting in the lower picture. So summer is definitely when we get into nesting time. So the birds in your yard are going to be really busy building nests. They're going to be busy gathering food, especially insects. This is usually when people start to wonder where the birds have gone from their feeders, and it's because birds are not getting most of their food from your feeder anyway, but especially during nesting time, they're getting a lot of food for their babies. So that's what they're working on, that's what they're concentrating on. And providing an array of plants to provide those insects for those birds is super important. Also, you'll see the fledglings around, especially later in summer. And those are the baby birds that are really fluffy looking. They don't fly well. They're pretty clumsy, really susceptible to predators. And those are the ones that are definitely need the most help from mom and dad. So again, birds nest really anywhere, depending on the bird. This is a nest that's in a winterberry holly. It's a very dense shrub. I'm not sure what bird made that nest, actually. This is a red-winged blackbird nest here, which is in a compass plant, which is a tall, very tall plant form. And it's just tucked right there in the middle. And then you have all the way down to another ground nester here, a killdeer, who will literally nest on, like, right here, a pile of gravel. So again, birds will nest everywhere, and if you provide different habitat, different things, it will provide the things they need. Like all these birds here are ground, they are cavity nesters. So they nest in a hole of a tree typically, or in a nest box that people provide, or sometimes other weird things, especially wrens. But as you can see, all these birds nest in cavities, but they all use different materials for their nest. Chickadee uses moss. House wren, if you see a bunch of sticks, that's a house wren. Tree swallows use grass as well as feathers, and they'll go around collecting feathers for their nest. They like white ones, it seems like. And then eastern bluebird is very grassy. House sparrows are a common one that nest in houses as well. They are an invasive and cause a lot of problems for cavity nesters, as do European starlings. And those guys are responsible for some of the declines of some of these birds, like the eastern bluebird. So one way you can tell a house sparrow nest is if you see grass, but it has a lot of seed heads, or has a lot of like garbage stuff mixed in, like string or bits of plastic, then it's a house sparrow. So this is just an example of a Baltimore oriole, a female, and she spent a good few weeks in my yard gathering material for her nest. And they build a sort of a hanging sack nest, and it's very intricately woven. It's really cool. You usually don't see them until winter when they're still hanging there because they hide them in like a bunch of leaves. But she's basically using some old stems that I left up from the previous fall of swamp milkweed. And it has these very tough, fibrous, stringy, I guess strings that you could that she would peel off, and as you can see, clump them up, and then she would go back and weave her nest. So if you can, leave your yard a little messy. It helps provide a lot of that material, provides the sticks and the stringy things they need, some patch of bare land for some mud that they can gather to, you know, kind of mush it all together depending on the bird. If you can, and again, only when it is safe to do so, leave dead trees and branches. Obviously, if it's over your house, don't leave the dead tree. But if it's, you know, if you have a little bit bigger backyard and, you know, it's out of the way, it's not bothering anybody, it's not a hazard, leave it up. Because it provides, again, more nesting habitat for cavity nesters, which again have been struggling with invasives to find nesting habitat. So the more we can provide, especially natural cavities, the better. So again, going back to insects, 95% of birds feed their chicks caterpillars of moths and butterflies. And again, native species are the host for those moths and butterflies. And again, like we said, the reason is because those insects have evolved to eat those specific plants. A lot of people will ask about cultivars and if a cultivar is okay and versus like a non-native. I try to stay away from non-natives because of that fact. Some non-natives that we see do not support really any insect life at all, and therefore are kind of a dead, ecologically dead plant. They're just kind of like a plastic tree. So if you want to support an actual population of birds and help them thrive and successfully raise chicks, the insects are super important. That's really what they need to grow, all that protein from those insects. So, like I was saying, cultivars, getting back to cultivars, I don't think cultivars, there's a lot of debate. I think one thing though to keep in mind with a cultivar, and really even natives that have been sort of over selected, is that if you are changing something about the plant, you might be changing something about it to the insect itself, whether it's how it looks, the chemical makeup of it, and that may reduce the amount of insects on that plant. Another thing to kind of note is that most of the native insects that munch on these plants don't actually hurt the plant. They've developed that relationship enough to where it's not going to kill the plant. The caterpillars aren't going to eat the plant to death. A lot of the insect damage we see is actually from non-native insects, like Japanese beetles are a huge one, that not only eat the lawn when they're larvae, but then they come up and they eat all the plants in your yard too, especially like roses and other things like that. So again, that relationship between the native plants and the insects is what provides that food for the birds. There were a couple studies done a few years ago that just sort of drove that point home, and it showed that chickadees need about 70% of the habitat to be native vegetation in order for the population to thrive. So if we all just took that number and said, hey, I'm going to make my yard 70% native species. I'm going to get rid of a lot of the lawn. Maybe I'll keep, this, lilac bush that I really love, even though it's not native and, whatever. But I love it, so I'm going to keep that. Even changing that number again to mostly native, I think would make a huge impact. Another one of the studies showed that within that habitat, chickadees went to the native plants far more than they went to the non-native stuff. And again, that's because that's where the food is, in the native plants. So one thing I think we kind of forget about sometimes is ground cover. We think about, these trees, these shrubs, all these beautiful flowers. We kind of forget about the ground. So the ground cover, though, is super important for fledglings because, again, they're clumsy. They can't really fly. They need a lot of protection. They need to be able to camouflage. So if you look at these 3 photos of the American robin here, who I don't even think could fly yet, so he was just hopping around on the ground, but you can see he blends in pretty well to the ground. He's broken up kind of with those speckles on his back as it's meant to be. Same with this great crested flycatcher. That one also could not fly when I found him, but Mom was right above my head screaming at me while I was looking at him and taking this picture. But he also blends in pretty well with these leaves, and we'll talk about leaves and that in a little bit. But if you look over here at these 2 wild turkey little babies, they stick out pretty well against that sod. And these 2 were actually on the trail under their mother until we got too close, and then Mom stood up and went into the brush off the trail along with most of the other babies. These 2 stayed behind, trying to blend in, but they're not blending in because they're on sod, basically. So it's summer. A lot of stuff in your yard is blooming, and you'll have a lot of hummingbirds around. And the more flowers you can provide, the better chances you'll have hummingbirds, and you'll have a lot of them. Hummingbirds are super unique birds. Their metabolisms are so fast and efficient because they burn so much energy, but because of how they fly, that they have to visit like almost 2,000 flowers a day. So they're very territorial, and they try to claim a patch of flowers. And especially a male will come and claim a patch of flowers to attract females, as well as he just needs it to survive. Hummingbirds also go into a semi-hibernation state while they go to sleep, because they literally would die because their metabolisms would starve to death while sleeping if they didn't go into that state to conserve energy. So if you plant a lot of a good mix of flowers, again, a succession of blooms throughout the summer, especially red, orange, blue, they really like those color flowers. Tubular flowers that provide a good amount of nectar is what they're after. So here I have pictured red monarda, which is probably one of their favorites, as well as wild bergamot, or the pinkish monarda, great blue lobelia, and this is a blazing star. That's rough blazing star. But they like, I've seen them go to asters as well. That might be a little more desperate, but they will visit smaller, compact flowers as well. Excuse me while I get a drink. So snags, brush piles, dead branches also provide food for birds in summer. It's also super important for hummingbirds, again, because they need to conserve energy. They actually spend a lot of time perching. If they're not feeding, they're pretty much perched, unless you're a male and you're defending your territory or doing a display for a female. But snags a lot of insects like to lay eggs and nest in, brush piles and snags. This little dead branch here with this worm-eating warbler who's picking away looking for little insects in there. Golden-winged warblers really love those dead branches. All right, so moving on to fruit. Again, another food source for birds. Fruits are very high in carbohydrates, so they provide a lot of quick energy. Some fruit is also high in fat, like this dogwood over here, which is especially helpful for birds trying to fatten up and fuel them on migration, fall migration. There are some not a lot of forbs provide fruit. Solomon seal is one, or starry Solomon seal. Pokeweed here is another. There are a lot of vines like Virginia creeper and wild grape that provide fruit that birds love. I know for the past couple months or so, where the grapes and the cherry trees have been blooming or fruiting, the birds have been all over them, especially the thrushes and even the littler guys like warblers. So like I said, I mentioned cherries. Plums are also really good fruit sources, and you can eat them too. I should also mention, also big amount of host species, so lots of caterpillars too in spring. This is one of my favorite groups of shrubs, mainly because I can eat the berries. But your ribes and rubus species, that's like your raspberries, your currants, your gooseberries. They're low-growing shrubs that provide thickets, so they also provide good shelter for birds, like this prickly gooseberry here that this American tree sparrow is in. And it also provides fruit for birds and for you. Serviceberry is a favorite of a lot of people because, one, it's a really pretty tree, really pretty flowers in spring, and it provides fruit that birds like cedar waxwings and robins and other thrushes really, really love. And you can eat serviceberry too. All right, so getting into autumn and winter now. And I kind of combine those because the challenges are kind of the same. You have fall migration, which if you're a birder or watch birds, fall migration is much slower than spring. Spring, the birds just, bam, they are through and they just want to get to their breeding grounds at start and get going. Fall, they're just kind of like, okay, we'll head back south, here we go. And then the juvies, they'll hang around longer, or, it's just a longer drawn out process. And then, especially once you get into winter, the local birds and the birds that overwinter in your area, they face obviously harsh weather, especially if you live in a northern state where winters can get really ugly. Birds also can face some really deadly conditions. So nuts. If you have trees and shrubs that provide nuts, like hazelnut over here is another favorite of mine. Great, medium-sized shrub. This is a hickory. Acorns are super important, probably one of the most important nuts in terms of a food source. Everything eats acorns, even foxes, turtles, wood ducks, turkeys, jays, everything eats acorns. But nuts are great because they last a long time. So they stay viable through winter. So a lot of birds will stash nuts. They're also very high in protein and fat. So it's good winter food for a lot of birds. So a lot of birds like this crow here is just chowing down acorns, and it's to help fatten them up for winter and help get that protein and fat they need. This red-headed woodpecker as well as a lot of other woodpeckers and chickadees and nuthatches will stash nuts and pieces of nuts as well as seeds for winter, as well as squirrels do, obviously. If you have squirrels around and they dig little holes everywhere. And that's how a lot of those trees get dispersed, actually. Seed is another important winter food source, again, because it stays viable through the colder weather and can last a really long time. This year, actually, this is a picture of siskins, pine siskins, which is a finch, on a big bunch of, I believe that's white pine, pine cones. They have been insane this year. I've counted almost, I almost had 2,000 in one day at Hawkwatch on the lakefront. And pine siskins are a eruption species, so they actually stay up north typically. But in a year where the food sources up north crash, they are forced to come down south. So this year, the siskins have been in extreme numbers heading south. So if you have any birch or especially arborvitae trees, they really like arborvitaes, and any sort of pine cone, really. And thistle feeders if you have a feeder. Seeds from forbs like aster or Joe Pye weed, coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, any of that, really any seed almost is eaten by birds. Grasses and sedges provide a huge seed source for birds, especially during winter and fall. And again, because that's when the seed becomes matures into a crop and it remains viable. So I typically in fall leave my yard kind of messy looking. I leave up a lot of seed heads. I don't deadhead or chop or clear anything out, and you don't really want to. And a couple of reasons for that is one is you leave up the seed heads for the birds. And a lot of finches, again, and sparrows really appreciate that winter food source. A lot of the native plants will stay up in the snow unless we get a ton of snow or a ton of heavy ice or something like that. They'll stay kind of above the snow. So they'll stay up for those and be available for birds. Another bird to look for kind of in weedy fields in especially late fall is the orange-crowned warbler. And he's not eating seeds, but there's still insects in those plants that he's going after. So if you leave your yard, a little messier in fall, you're providing habitat for those insects to overwinter too. I'll get a little bit into that. But also, especially, you're leaving up all that seed for the birds to eat. And even if the seed heads get, blown down, there's a lot of seed in the soil and, on the edges of your driveway where it melts and stuff like that, that the birds are going to get. So some fruit, a lot of fruit doesn't stay viable into fall or winter, but there are some things that do, like eastern red cedar, and that's kind of a fruit cone. It's kind of a weird thing. But sumac, like this gray catbird is on, is also a great winter berry because it stays viable through the winter. So it's not maybe their first, source of food choice like sumacs. Cedar waxwings love cedar berries. That's why they're named cedar waxwings. But other sort of late season fruit like chokeberries or even winterberry holly, birds kind of save that for later, more of an emergency food, or later in the season when there's other food sources have already been sort of depleted. So leave the leaves. I'm sure many of you who garden have heard this expression. Excuse my shaking. And a lot of that is because a lot of insects will overwinter in that leaf litter. A lot of moths, the pupas of beetles, and a lot of other things will be in that leaf litter. and that provides a winter and fall and early spring food source for birds. That's extremely important. And you'll often find when snow melts or it starts to thaw, a lot of birds will be down in those leaves picking at things and trying to find food. Besides the food aspect, the leaves also provide camouflage. If you look at this eastern towhee and this worm-eating warbler, they kind of blend in to that background with the leaves and the sticks and, again, that messier sort of look. If those birds were against, green sod, they would stick out like sore thumbs to a predator like a Cooper's hawk. So again, another reason to leave stuff up over winter is the woody stems of the forbs, so like of sunflowers or coneflowers or monarda, any flower stem that kind of stays up. A lot of insects will stay in those stems over winter. And if you've ever seen these galls left by gull flies, that's a favorite snack for downy woodpeckers and chickadees. And they'll peck a little hole in there and pull out that larva, and that's a great treat for them. And that's why in spring, I leave, when I do cut and clean up my yard, I cut everything down to about 18 inches tall still. And that's because there's still a lot of insects in those plants that I want to come out. And also because other insects and things like carpenter bees will use those stems to nest in spring and summer. Also, again, leaving your yard kind of messy leaves room for chickadees and other things to stash things. So I watched a chickadee stash this little seed of a sunflower seed into that little broken off branch there to come back and get it later. Log piles are great, again, for the same reason that they provide overwintering habitat for insects. So a lot of, if you've ever broken apart kind of a decaying log, you'll see a lot of holes and stuff in it. And a lot of that's from beetles and other larvae that have nested in that log. And the birds will like to find those insects and dig them out. So especially birds like wrens, and if you've seen brown creepers creep up the bark of trees or nuthatches, and they'll pull insects out of bark and in log piles out of those decaying logs. And you don't need a big log pile. You can just have little ones kind of. I have a bunch of little ones just kind of in sections of my yard, nothing too, a huge brush pile or something like that. There we go. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about shelter, especially in winter, because that's obviously when weather and the elements are at their worst. Birds also need shelter at all times of the year, but obviously winter is a little bit more desperate for shelter. So kind of all the things we talked about, where we have structural diversity, we have some bigger trees, we have some shrubs, we have our forbs and our grasses kind of down below to provide those different sections that birds need depending on the type of bird. Like you can see, this mourning dove is sitting there on the ground, and it was a really nasty storm, and she just sat there all day under my pine tree, just keeping warm as she could. Hermit thrushes stay really low to the ground, so they like really shrubby stuff. This is a Kirkland's warbler, which is probably it is the rarest songbird in North America, and they tend to stay mid-level, small trees, so probably not one you expect to see, but you never know. So again, we have just some more examples. These are just asters, the branches of woody, aster plants that have folded over and this fox sparrow would jump out, go get a seed from under the feeder, and then go back underneath those branches that kind of folded over. And again, he stuck out in the snow. So if a Cooper's hawk was flying over and he wasn't hidden in some way, he would have been an easy target. So same here, here's a little palm warbler hiding away and foraging low in some weedy field. This is a common redpoll hiding in a dense shrub. Okay, sorry, couldn't get the slide to go. So I talked a little bit about sumacs, again, providing that winter fruit that can be a good emergency source of food. And there's some great sumacs that aren't super aggressive, like some sumacs are, that you can incorporate in your yard. They also provide really good habitat for a shelter. You can see it forms kind of a colony, a lot of them. Dogwoods are a really important family of shrubs because they tend to form, again, colonies. So they provide really good habitat for nesting, for shelter for birds, as well as really good fruit for birds, especially towards the end of fall when migration is starting. Viburnums is another, kind of like the dogwoods, really good fruit source, grows in a variety of habitats, a variety of heights and styles, if, for lack of a better word. So there's, in terms of dogwoods and viburnums, there's really one for every yard that you can find to fit, whether it's shady, sunny, whether it's more wet, more dry. There's a viburnum and dogwood for every yard. Birches are really good for especially winter finches. A lot of the finches that come down from the north in eruption years are seed eaters, and they love, a lot of them like birch, like redpolls especially, and crossbills as well. We don't have a lot of birch in my area. You get bog birch, some river birches, paper birch more up north like Wisconsin, Minnesota. So this is just a list of more shrubs that are great for birds. Really, any native shrub is going to provide something for birds. There's such a variety out there that you can really find anything, and that really goes for forbs and grasses, sedges, all of that. A lot of people, when I'm helping them with their yard, you know, they try to go to, you know, a typical store and buy, you know, kind of the typical plants that you find, and it doesn't work in a specific area because it's too shady, or it's under pine trees, and pine trees are super acidic, so not a lot grows under them. But there's definitely a native that will grow there. There's a native for every little niche out there, and that's how they've evolved. And they've evolved for our habitat and for you know, your local area. So you want to kind of keep in that area. But one thing I've started to do over the recent years is I have hedge plants, I call them, not like hedge, like more like a hedge fund. Just a sort of bet against climate change. So I started planting some more southern Illinois plants, or some species that maybe are more native to the southern United States up north, just to sort of adapt for climate change. And we'll see how that works. That's a bit of an experiment. I also have this list too of suggested plants that I can email out to whoever wants it. Real quickly, water sources. Obviously, any living thing needs water. So if you can provide, if you don't have a natural water source on your property or nearby, then you might want to provide one. It also helps attract a lot of birds in that may not, definitely that don't want to stop at feeders. So winter, if you can provide a heated bird bath, that is also a great idea because winter is really dry, and if it's really cold and a lot of other water sources are frozen over, it can be really hard for birds to get water. So if you can provide a heated bird bath, that would be great. And don't worry, they will not freeze. They know when it's too cold to bathe, but bathing is also still really important to maintain their feathers, to help maintain that warmth. So don't be worried about providing a bird bath in winter. They won't take a bath in a freeze. They'll be okay. So we're getting towards the end here. Hang in there. These are good visitors to your yard. Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks, they are the predators. They mainly feed on small songbirds. So especially if you have feeders, they will eventually show up and show around because you are setting up a buffet for them basically, and an easy target. So again, if you're providing adequate habitat and enough cover for birds and shelter, or in terms of shrubs or trees, and some ground cover with forbs and shrub or grasses, then they'll have a little bit of chance of escaping the Cooper's hawks and the sharp-shinned hawks. But they're part of the ecosystem and they're super important. So don't, a lot of people will email and be like, oh, there's a Cooper's hawk and it's, terrorizing my feeders. And it's like, well, yeah, because that's what it's going for. And the birds are attracted to your feeders and they're attracted to the birds. So, but that's okay. So, again, if you're providing enough cover for them, the birds will have a safe place to hide, most of them. All right, this is another not good, well, this guy is not a good visitor for your yard. And cats are also extremely, extremely efficient predators. They're killers and they're good at it. And they will not only hunt birds, but they'll hunt insects. I've seen them eat grasshoppers and other insects, as well as frogs, definitely small mammals like mice and voles and stuff like that. So cats are good at what they do, and it's not their fault. But if you do have a cat, it's best to keep it inside for the birds, because especially during fledgling season, when all the baby birds are out in summer and they can't fly very well, they are so easy to pick off. And cats will hunt birds and other things, even if they're not hungry, and even if they're well fed. So it's just what they do. So please keep your cats inside. If you have problems with neighborhood cats, I know that can be a little bit more difficult. That's why I keep my hose handy. And if I see one that keeps coming around, just a quick spray usually is enough to get them out of there without hurting the cat. These are also not great for birds in your yard. Invasive plants and non-native plants, again, non-natives don't provide the support for insects, and they're not the host plants for a lot of our insects that birds need. Invasive plants go a step further and try to take over everything. Most of you, if you have a garden, you've probably dealt with buckthorn or honeysuckle or garlic mustard, and even things like burning bush, Bradford pears. They can really take over an area and eliminate the biodiversity. If you're eliminating the biodiversity of the plants, you're going to eliminate the biodiversity of the insects. And if you go birding, and if you end up going through a monoculture of plants, you'll notice far less birds in that habitat than you would a nice, diverse habitat with a lot of diverse vegetation. When it comes to chemicals, it's best to avoid pesticides and fertilizers. Pesticides, I think, is kind of obvious because you want the insects, you want the bird food. The chemical fertilizers, you don't need them. If you're planting the plants that belong in the space that, you know, your yard, if you're planting for your yard, then the plants will be fine. You don't need to add fertilizer or amend anything to try to help them grow. They should be happy where you put them. If you plant something and it's not doing well, it's probably just not happy in that spot. It's not, the soil acidity might not be right, or the moisture, whatever it is, but I would just plant another plant there. Herbicides can get a little more controversial. I do use herbicide on occasion when I cannot get rid of an invasive like buckthorn any other way, or honeysuckle, something that resprouts when you cut it. And if you can't dig it out physically, and you need to get rid of it, then the cut and dab method is really efficient, and it keeps the herbicide directed at the plant you want. So if you are going to use herbicide, I would say only use it when absolutely necessary. Definitely protect yourself, wear gloves, you know, full clothing. You don't want it on your skin. I've gotten it on my skin, and I've gotten chemical burns from it. So always use caution when you're using heavy chemicals. Another common problem we see is window collisions. And obviously, window collisions kill millions to billions of birds every year. And a lot of that is big buildings and lights on at night, especially those big buildings in big cities. But a lot of birds do hit regular residential windows as well. One product I find that works really, really well is the ABC or Kaleidoscape bird tape. This is the kind of older version, which is like a bluish haze, and then this is the clear. I've had the tape on my windows for 4 or 5 years now, and have not had any evidence of a strike at all. And I used to have what I call a death window, where I would get thrushes and warblers and woodpeckers and just everything every other day, you know, just hitting that window. So it's very easy to install, it's pretty cheap, and to me, it looks much cleaner and much nicer than some of the other options available, like those decals that don't really work. Because you have to make sure you're separating up that glass, that you're breaking up that glass enough to really make an impact. And if you're just putting up a couple decals, you're not really going to make a difference. I've seen people use the clear markers. Again, if you're okay with drawing on your windows, that's fine. Some people just use a bar of soap and just wet the bar of soap and just cover their whole window with it. Doesn't look as nice, but it's an option. Definitely a cheap one. So, but this one I found to be super easy and effective. If you do use feeders, or if you see any birds that are sick or injured or you know, not doing so great, it's good to document them. One thing that's been going around, especially you'll see probably during winter, maybe some of you have already seen it, is called finch eye disease, and it affects mostly house finches, but can also affect goldfinches and other finches. But here's an example of a female. You can see her eye is swollen shut. It's kind of crusty, gross looking, and it doesn't kill the birds, but it definitely makes them more susceptible to predators. Like watching this one, I could tell she couldn't see out of the one eye, so she's flying weird. She's not very confident in what she's doing, so it definitely makes them more susceptible to predators. So it's good to document when we see these things, so scientists can see when an outbreak is occurring. And you can do that by participating on ebird.org, which is just a really awesome checklist sort of keeping database where you document the birds you see. and it loads it in there for you, keeps all the information. You can look at other data. I mean, it's an amazing resource. I definitely check it out. Feederwatch.org is also done by Cornell Lab, who does eBird, and that is specifically during November through April, and that is specifically focused on feeder birds and documenting what you're seeing at your feeders. So that's another great citizen science project that you can participate from home, and especially during the winter months when you're probably looking at your bird feeder anyway, it's a great project to get involved in. So where to get native plants? Depending on where you are, there's local nurseries. Definitely check out your local plant sales through your local environmental organizations or your park district, or gardening groups do a lot of them. And natives are becoming a lot more popular. A lot more people are getting into native plants and seeing the advantages of native plants. So they're often in high demand, but right now is a great time to really plan out your garden, or a section of your yard that you want to convert to a garden, or if you want to replace, a burning bush with something else like a wahoo or something like that, an eastern wahoo. This is the time to think about it. And I would recommend, if you're going to do an order through a nursery or even an online one, I would suggest getting it in by February the latest, because a lot of stuff sells out quite quickly, especially popular plants. So, oh, and I think it goes without saying, but please don't harvest plants from parks or your conservation district or natural areas. It does happen. I have seen people walking out with plants that they just dug up and carried out of a forest preserve. Even taking things like seed isn't allowed in some areas, but you might want to just leave it, just because a lot of park districts and conservation districts use their own seed on their own properties, and it helps save them a ton of money. So with that, I don't know if there's any questions. I can check the chat.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I'm sure everybody's going to have a long list of things they're going to be ready to purchase in the spring. I just might note that the ChicagoLivingCorridors.org website, Carol Rice puts up a list of all of the plant sales in the spring, what the dates of them and where they're located. So you can find some all around the Chicago area, wherever you might be located. We've run a little over, so if you need to go off, we understand, but Lisa will hang around for a few minutes and answer some questions. If you've put some in the chat, Iris is going to moderate, so she'll look at them for you and read them for you to respond to. If you can hang around, it's useful because you might learn from other people's questions as well. Just to close real quickly, this slide about the kind of things sort of reinforce what Lisa's been saying. We definitely want you to plant natives, but also spread the word that the Chicago Living Corridors website is a great resource with lots of resources of all sorts on it. But in addition, we have been posting these presentations, making them available afterwards. So if you, for example, Lisa had a list of some of the plants that you might want. If you weren't able to scribble them down quickly enough, you can reseed or rewatch the this webinar, or recommend it to other people that you might think might be interested in seeing it. So if you already have good habitat, or you're expanding it and would like to get it on the map, make sure you connect with one of the participating organizations to see about the possibility of you being a dot on our map. So, thanks, Lisa.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Oh, well, we'll leave up the next program in November is on your screen now. It's going to be a very interesting program. It's Doris Anderson is a professional with open lands, but he also has done a major restoration on his own property in, I think he's in McHenry County. He's out up in the north area.
Yep.
So that'll be a fun one to listen to as well. Okay, let's go to the questions. Iris, are you going to moderate?
Yes, sure can. So here also is the contact information, Lisa's email address if you have questions specifically for her, and then also, again, the Chicago Living Corridors website and email and Facebook page. I also dropped in the chat box the link to the registration page for next month's webinar, so you can check it out there. We do have a couple of questions that come in for Lisa. First one is, what are some good native plants for hummingbirds?
So hummingbirds really like tubular flowers. So in early spring, they really like columbine, wild columbine, which is red and yellow. Tubular, it blooms really early, so that's a good one. Foxglove is another good one. Beard tongue or pale foxglove is another one. I'm sorry, I don't know scientific names very well. I can't pronounce them, but if you go to like IllinoisWildflowers.com and type it in, you'll get all the native ones. It will tell you if they're native or not. Monarda is another one. All species of Monarda. Blue lobelia, cardinal flower, the blazing stars are all good. Milkweed. I think most importantly, just try to have a lot of flowers and a lot of different sort of ones, and that will provide enough for them to have enough food for them.
I might also just mention,
Okay.
try not to just have one of something.
Mm-hmm.
You have a group of whatever, like a group of columbine, the birds are more likely to find it and then be able to go from one flower to another and get more nectar that way.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
On the topic of hummingbirds, so we have someone who has a small suburban yard with a hummingbird feeder. She's wondering, should she hang 2 feeders, one for the males and one for the females?
So I do recommend hanging multiple feeders if you're going to have feeders, because hummingbirds are very territorial. You won't have necessarily males go to one and females go to the other, but what you will have, especially in fall, is a lot of fighting, because the young males will come into a territory and they'll start fighting with the males and they'll all just kind of start going crazy. And the more feeders you have, and especially if you kind of space them out a little bit, it kind of gives them a little more space, and then they don't fight quite as often. You'll still get fights, and that's totally fine. Again, hummingbirds are very aggressive. They are very feisty little birds, and it's okay that they fight. But in fall, when you start to get the young coming in and you start getting a lot of hummingbirds, it's good to have a few multiple feeders, just again to give them all a little space and give them all opportunity to get your feeders. I will say too, keep your feeders up. I know some people think that hummingbirds will hang around because of the feeder, but they won't. They know when to leave and they'll leave. But now is when you tend to get either some stragglers coming through or hummingbirds that have wandered. And sometimes you get some rare hummingbirds like Anna's or Rufus hummingbirds instead of just our typical ruby-throated hummingbird. So it's good to keep your hummingbird feeders up really until it freezes, just to make sure any stray ones coming through have something, because now the flowers are really starting to die off in terms of blooming.
Okay, thank you. We have someone who has a red-bellied woodpecker that spent weeks drilling a big nest in her yard, but starlings took over the nest.
Yeah.
Any suggestions to keep the starlings away?
Those are, unfortunately, starlings are very hard, because usually, red-headed woodpeckers are typically pretty high up where they build nests, so they're not easy to get to. And unfortunately, the advantage that starlings have are numbers. So typically, you'll have a pair of, woodpeckers trying to build a nest. You'll get a whole group of starlings coming in, just taking over. And sometimes they'll just try to take over just because they can, kind of. Every year I watch the hummingbird or the starlings fight with the red bellies in my neighbor's maple trees over, there's several holes and a few branches, and usually they get one. So that's why I think it's important to leave, if you can, dead branches and leave that up. You can try to scare away the starlings by making loud clapping sounds, but usually they'll just come back. It's really hard to get rid of them. If you have feeders around, you might want to just take the feeders out, because that will also attract starlings. So you might want to just, especially during the breeding season, just not have feeders up to try to keep them away. But yeah, starlings are definitely a big problem. And not just for woodpeckers, but American kestrels, our tiniest falcon, is losing out pretty big to starlings, and their numbers have been declining for years. And unfortunately, starlings have just been decimating their population. So if you can and you feel comfortable removing those nests of those invasive species, it does help. If you don't feel comfortable doing that for ethical reasons, that's understandable. But if you're okay with that, and especially if you manage boxes, those invasive species like house sparrows and starlings should be removed, just because they are very detrimental to cavity nester birds.
Okay, thank you. When should we clean out our bluebird houses?
So I would clean out your bluebird houses now, at the end of the breeding season. Usually bluebirds nest early, so they'll usually nest starting April, and then usually have a second, sometimes a third brood later on in the season, but usually they're done by August, so when you notice they're done nesting, clean it out. Even after the first time they nest, you can clean out that nest and they'll build a new one if something else doesn't move in, like a wren or a house sparrow. But definitely I would clean them out now. That way birds can roost in there. If like a chickadee or a woodpecker or something else gets into bad weather, they can use that nest box, or even bluebirds can use that nest box during the winter months for shelter. So I would just clean them out now, and it helps keep mice and stuff out of there too.
Okay, thank you. Another question from someone who has a hackberry tree, wondering if birds eat their nuts, which are very tiny.
Hackberry? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, hackberry.
Yeah, hackberry definitely is one birds will eat. Again, pretty much any fruit, any nut, any seed, there's some bird that eats it. There's very few things I found that birds won't eat. They're pretty opportunistic, most birds. They'll eat whatever they can find. So but hackberry is definitely one they will eat. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Next question. When digging up honeysuckle bushes, do you think it's okay to leave the dead carcasses for shelter and so forth, even though they're not native?
Yeah, if they're fully dead, I don't think it's going to harm anything. Honeysuckles, though, will usually resprout at the bottom. Even if like most of it's dead, they'll. I have one that I chopped and poisoned, and this year again it started to come up, and so they're pretty tenacious. But if it's fully dead, you can leave it. It should provide some of the more the bark burrowing insects, more so. But Honeysuckles, if it's dead, probably won't stand for very long either. The branches will probably tend to start falling. So, I mean, if you want to leave it, leave it. And then, you know, eventually it's going to start falling down, and then you can get rid of it and put something else up in its place.
And final question here, I'm going to combine a couple. Do you have any suggestions for where to find layout plans with suggested placements for plants, or any other resources for the design, installation, and maintenance of these plants?
So I think one good book to check out is Birding in the Midwest, or Birdscaping in the Midwest by Maria Novak. I'm not sure exactly on the name, but that one definitely had Mariette, thank you. Mariette Novak. So in that book, there are some layouts that for different, especially shrub structures and stuff like that. I would also suggest checking out Pollinators of Native Plants and by Heather Holm, which is more of a book about pollinators, but it's also about native plants, and it suggests plants that do well together. There's also, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, the WPPC though, one of the great things about the mentoring program, and having even resources like on Facebook, there's a lot of great botany groups and native plant groups on Facebook that can offer a lot of advice. But one of the things I love about the mentoring program is having someone there to really help you make those decisions, like from start to finish. And if you run into a problem, how to sort of address it. I found a lot of just planning and stuff like that is trial and error. Plants move. They don't stay where you want them to, especially natives. If they, like, I've had plants that I plant and it will literally be a few feet over next spring, because it likes that spot a little better. So I think natives are generally better in a more naturalized setting. You can plant them, you know, more in a, you know, symmetrical, spaced out, you know, with mulch around it sort of look, more clean and typical sort of suburban garden look, but it's harder to maintain that. So I think when you're thinking of layout, look at, you know, sort of the natural areas around you too. What plants are growing together? There's some great apps like Picture This, which help you ID plants pretty quickly, or iNaturalist is another one to help you ID stuff. So I think a combination of things, and just same with like I tell people with birding, if you really want to know birding or you know, anything else, native plants, you kind of have to combine, you have to do, you know, study, experience, talk to other people. It's like learning anything else. But in terms of layout, definitely check out some of those books. The Living Landscape by Doug Talmy has some great photos and some ideas for layouts too. There's a lot of stuff out there, and check out, like I said, the Facebook pages. There's a lot of people that have a lot of great suggestions, a lot of great problem solving ideas. So those resources can be really good as well as your local groups like gardening groups or like the WPPC that specifically you know, caters towards, you know, helping people create a habitat.
Okay, wonderful. That's the extent of our questions for today. So thank you again, Lisa. We hope to see you all at our next webinar in November. And again, if you haven't clicked it yet, the link to the registration is in the chat box, which you might want to grab before we end the meeting.
And we would appreciate,
have a good evening.
Well, we would appreciate you filling out our survey at the end as you sign up tonight. Thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Yeah,
and if you have specific questions, they showed my email. Feel free to email me, and I can kind of dig in deeper too as well. And yeah, definitely see Durr's presentation. He's a very interesting guy, and yes, I've been to the area he's restored, and I mean the work he's put in is amazing. So yeah, it should be a good presentation.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yes, thank you everybody, and everybody have a great night.